What if everything you've been leaning on for spiritual security was never meant to carry the full weight of your faith? What if rules, traditions, and religious effort were only signposts, not the destination? The book of Hebrews was written to people who were exhausted, pressured, and tempted to give up. And its message is bold and unmistakable: Jesus is not one option among many. He is greater than everything that came before him, and he is worth holding on to, no matter the cost. Overview. Hebrews is one of the most theologically rich and pastorally urgent books in the New Testament. It was written to Jewish believers who knew the Old Testament deeply. They understood the law, the sacrifices, the priesthood, and the temple system. But as persecution increased, many were tempted to return to what felt familiar and safer. The author of Hebrews does not shame them. Instead, he reminds them of who Jesus truly is. From the very first chapter, Hebrews declares that God has spoken fully and finally through his Son. Jesus is not merely a prophet or teacher. He is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his nature. Throughout the book, Hebrews carefully explains that everything in the Old Testament was pointing forward to Christ. The sacrifices, the priests, the covenant, and even the law itself were never the final answer. They were shadows. Jesus is the reality. Historical and social setting. Hebrews was written during a time when following Christ came with real consequences. Believers faced social rejection, loss of status, and in some cases imprisonment or violence. For Jewish Christians, the pressure was even greater. Returning to Judaism meant safety, acceptance, and familiarity. The book addresses this tension directly. It speaks to believers who are weary, spiritually drifting, or questioning whether their faith is worth the struggle. Hebrews does not minimize suffering. Instead, it reframes it, showing that endurance is part of a faithful life and that God remains faithful even in hardship. Key themes in Hebrews. The supremacy of Christ. Hebrews repeatedly shows that Jesus is greater than angels, greater than Moses, greater than the priesthood, and greater than the Old Covenant. He is not part of the system. He is the fulfillment of it. Jesus as the perfect high priest. Unlike earthly priests who offered repeated sacrifices, Jesus offered himself once and for all. His sacrifice fully deals with sin and opens direct access to God. The New Covenant. The Old Covenant revealed sin but could not remove it completely. The New Covenant, established through Christ, brings forgiveness, transformation, and a restored relationship with God. Warnings against drifting away. Hebrews contains strong warnings, not to instill fear, but to call believers to vigilance. Faith must be held onto intentionally. Neglect leads to drift. Faith and endurance. Faith is not blind optimism. Hebrews defines faith as confidence in God's promises, even when fulfillment is unseen. The call is to endure, not retreat. Key passages and their meaning. Hebrews 1 verses 1-2 declares that God has spoken through his Son, establishing Jesus as the final and complete revelation of God. Hebrews 4 verse 16 invites believers to approach God's throne with confidence, knowing that Christ understands human weakness and intercedes on their behalf. Hebrews 7 explains Jesus' priesthood as eternal, modeled after Melchizedek, not limited by death or lineage. Hebrews 8 and 9 contrast the Old and New Covenants, showing how Christ's sacrifice accomplishes what the law never could. Hebrews 10 verses 19-22 calls believers to draw near to God with sincere hearts, made clean through Christ's sacrifice. Hebrews 11 presents the great hall of faith, reminding readers that God's people have always lived by trust, not by sight. Hebrews 12 urges believers to run the race with endurance, fixing their eyes on Jesus, who endured the cross for the joy set before him. Relevance Today. Hebrews speaks directly to modern believers who feel tired, distracted, or spiritually uncertain. It challenges shallow faith and warns against reducing Christianity to routine or comfort. In a world full of competing voices, Hebrews reminds us that Christ alone is sufficient. When faith becomes difficult, this book calls believers not to go back, but to go deeper. Closing thought. If you've ever wondered whether following Christ is worth the struggle, Hebrews answers with clarity and conviction. Jesus is greater than tradition, stronger than suffering, and faithful beyond measure. Hold on. Keep going. Fix your eyes on him. What he offers is not temporary comfort, but eternal hope.